All right, Shabbos, good morning, and let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Haba Alinu Litova, Allison Adam Steinmetz, seems a little loud, Allison Adam Steinmetz, in memory of Adam's grandfather, Rabbi Shmuel Steinmetz, Harav Shlomo Tzvi Ruvain Ben Shimon, Zichron Livracha, Samuel Malka Esterson, in honor of their parents, Yitzchak Leib Ben Sarah Ben Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim and Mordechai Ben Yonah, and in memory of their dear family friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yonah Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo. Paul and Kathy Pollack in memory of Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Shulamis Bas Shmuel, and Esther Bas Zachariah. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, in the source of continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, and for an ultimate and enduring refuah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, their families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should happen together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Is this very loud? It is. Yeah, it's good. Okay. Kol Cholei Yisrael, Meretz Hashem Halayim, Yilchem Hashem to Besoros Tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. But also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Tzadik K95. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tzadik Dalid Amud Beis 94b, 15 lines up from the Mishnah at the two dots, so that might be easier. Hakibos b'makom kadosh. So let's remember again, the Mishnah really highlighted to us a number of really fascinating ideas. So the Mishnah says over here that, or the Gemara, the Mishnah said that halacha l'maaseh kibos, laundering must take place within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Minahani mili. So from where do we know that? The Titan Rabbanon, tichabes b'makom kadosh. All right, the pasuk is pretty explicit. The pasuk says, "You shall launder in a holy place." Shviras kli chares minayin. They both say, now if you remember again from the Mishnah highlighted a number of different activities which themselves must take place within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Another example was breaking of kli chares. As we spoke about yesterday, whenever you go ahead and you consume sacrificial meat within a utensil, so remember the utensil needs some type of purging process. Why? Because the absorptions over time will potentially become nosar. So remember again, in this case over here, if you have a kli chares can't be kashered. So because it can't be kashered, it has to be smashed, has to be broken. So where is that breakage done? Again, in the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Where Talmud Lomar, v'ukli chares asher tevushal bo yishaber. As the pasuk says, ultimately again, any kli chares that you put karbanos inside of it shall be smashed. And once again, just like it said, so again, and therefore we learn from here that has to be done on Makom Mikdash. Mariko Shtifa Beklina Choshes Minayim. Now both say that Marika and Shtifa refers to the process of Marika literally means like kashering, and Shtifa is washing. So remember again, this is really talking about if you're using non-earthenware utensils for karbanos. So first of all, the carbonic matter has to be washed away. And again, if it's hot and there are absorptions, it needs to be kashered. How do I know that needs to be done inside of the confines of the Beis Hamikdash? Talmud Lomar, v'im b'klina choshes bushala umurak b'shotav b'mayim. Incredible. So we'll say, so fascinatingly enough, all of these what we'll call like purging, cleansing types of processes, whether again it's the kibus for the blood that splatters on the clothing, or ultimately again it's the shvira of the kli chares, or marika and shtifa of other kelim, all must be done within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Which I will say, if you think about it, is a tremendous musar haskell as well. Because what's the common denominator between all of these things, right? Kibus, shvira, marika, shtifa, they all represent processes through which we go ahead and, bless you, through which we expunge something which is absorbed. Now, granted, in kli chares, you can't really expunge it so you break it, but the idea is I have something that I need to get rid of. That's what's happening over here. I need to get the blood out of the clothing. I need to go ahead and get the absorptions out of the earthenware, or at least render the earthenware useless. I need to get the absorptions out of the metallic kli, right, the metal kli. How do you do it? It has to be done in the Beis Hamikdash. If you want to go ahead and expunge the things that are absorbed inside of you, that you don't want part of you anymore, you have to embed yourself in an atmosphere of holiness. A person has to put themselves, these things could only happen in the Mikdash. If I do not create an environment of holiness for myself, it's very difficult to expunge the negative things that are absorbed inside of me. Whereas if I embed myself in a mikdash, if I embed myself in an atmosphere of holiness, then I'm really able to tackle my problems. I'm able to tackle my issues, and I'm able to expunge sometimes the things that I really need to rid myself of. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So remember again, I will say, interestingly enough, what we saw, and this is quite fascinating because I don't know that we would have picked this up if the Mishnah had not stated it explicitly, the concept of kibos, right? The concept of laundering clothing, if blood splatters on it, is dafka adin in chatas. Dafka din in chatas blood, not to other blood. So the Mishnah said, this is a chumrah. This is a stringency that chatas has over other karbanos. I will say, now what's interesting is the way that the Gemara reads the Mishnah is that it makes it sound like this is the only stringency that chatas has over other karbanos. So the Gemara says, "V'sulaka." There are no other stringencies that chatas has. What about va'iga shedama nichnas lefnai v'lefnim? 1 second. Chatas is the only type of karban ultimately where the blood is brought into the kodesh hakadoshim. Right? Again, you have a chatas pnimi. So doesn't that make isn't that a chumrah of chatas? No, the Gemara says we're talking about over here bechatas achitzonios she'in nichnas dama lefnai v'lefnim. Right? I'm sorry. The Gemara says, no. But what we're discussing over here are outer chatas offerings, not inner chatas offerings. Because again, by outer chatas offerings, Rabbi Akiva, the Amar called Damim shenichnesu lehecha lechaper psula. Because Rabbi Akiva holds that in general, any exterior blood that is brought in the inside ultimately is invalid. So we're not talking about that aspect of chatas. What about shechin mechaper al chayve krisos? What about the fact that chatas is more chamer? I will say why? Because chatas, remember again, I will say in general, when do you bring a carbon chatas? Carbon chatas is brought for any type of infraction where if had you done it intentionally, you would be chayiv kares. If you do it unintentionally, ultimately you bring a carbon chatas. So the Gemara says, what about the fact that Allah l'maisa chatas is mechaper on kares bearing prohibitions? To which Gemara says, no, bechatas the shmias kol. We're talking about over here the chatas of shmias kol. Shmias kol means we will say that if you know testimony for someone and you are called upon to give testimony and you do not do so, halacha l'maisa, again, there's liability for that. Now that's not a kares bearing prohibition, right? That's something else. Okay, so that's the type of chatas talking about. What about the fact she came to una arba matanos? What about the fact that chatas is unique because chatas requires 4 blood applications, whereas most other karbanos only require 2? Rabbi Shmuel, Damar called Dam Tun and Dalet Matanos and Dalet Kronos. According to Rabbi Shmuel, right? Because the Mishnah refers to Rabbi Shmuel holds that all karbanos require 4 blood applications. Ulatam meich. So we're just trying to show other areas where chatas is more chamer. But according to our reasoning, ha'ika keren, right? Ha'ika etzba, ha'ika chuda. What about the fact that again, chatas has its blood applications on the corners of the mizbeh? It has to be done with the finger of the coin as opposed to just like a sprinkling of the kli. And what about the fact that even when placed on the corners, it has to be placed on the edge of the corner. So these are all different examples of chumras that chatas has over everything else. Ella chad mitrei tlasa chumrinak. The Gemara says, no, you're right. The Mishnah did not mean to say that this is the only chumrah of chatas. Rather, what it meant is it's amongst the chumras of chatas. Right? Yes, chatas has more chumras over other karbanos, but it happens to be, for our purposes, the one chumrah that we are focusing on is this idea that chatas requires kibos, whereas the blood of other karbanos does not require kibos. Okay, incredible. Says the Mishnah, beged sheyatzu chutz l'kilayim. So this is a very interesting case here. So now just to frame this, right? So we've established now that if chatas blood gets on a garment, the garment requires kibos. We've also established that the kibos, the laundering, can only be done inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself. Okay, so now that we've established that, beged sheyatzu chutz l'kilayim nichnas umechabso b'makom kadosh. We'll say, watch this. So let's say you have the garment, right? The garment got blood splatter on it. So now what happened? Someone took the garment out. And by the way, both say, when we speak about a garment getting blood splatter on it, Bepashtos, what are we talking about? Which garment? right? Bipashtos is big day kahuna, right? That's bipashtos what we're talking about. Although again, I guess it could be like a Levi's garment also if he's running around over there, but again, bipashtos big. So the reason I'm telling you this is important. Watch this. So now the blood is on the garment, right? What are you supposed to do? Kibbutz. But for some reason, it was taken outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so the Mishnah says, no problem. Nichnas umechabsa makom kadosh. No problem. So what do you do if it was taken out? What do you do if it was taken out? Bring it back in. As Rabbi say, sometimes if there's a problem, just find a solution, right? Again, we don't need to obsess over it, right? We don't have to talk about the problem, just solve it, right? So it was taken outside, bring it back in. Good. Next, that's case one. Now, here's the wrinkle. So the Gemara says, nitma chutz l'kilayim. Okay, here's the problem. Let's say, so again, same garment got chatas blood on it, was taken outside of the Beis Hamikdash. When it was outside of the Beis Hamikdash, it became tamei. So we'll say, now we have a problem. What's the problem? You are not allowed to bring something tamei into the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. The problem, however, is you could only do kibbutz in the Beis Hamikdash. So we're stuck a little bit in a catch-22. I can't bring the garment into the Mikdash, but yet the only way to do kibbutz is in the Mikdash. So what do I do? So nitma chutz l'kilayim, if it became tamei, ultimately again outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and now I can't bring that garment as is into the Mikdash. What do? Listen to this. Koro, you rip it, right? You tear it. Now, you tear it, nichnas umechabsa makam kodesh. You tear it, then it becomes tahar, and then you go ahead and you bring it into the mikdash and you launder it. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Koro, it's almost right across Rashi. If you move your finger to the left, about 4 lines down. Koro, v'tahar mituma, umut lahachnisa v'nichnas umechabsa makam kodesh. So remember again, and this is an important rule in general, when a utensil becomes tamei, so obviously one way to purify it is to subject it to a purification process. There is another way to purify it, which is how? If essentially you remove the identity of the item. If the item no longer has its identity, right, therefore the tumah goes away because tumah attaches itself to an identity. If the identity is gone, so by the way, the paradigmatic example of this is if you have a utensil that's tamei, right, and you bore a hole on the bottom of the utensil, let's say so big that it can't even hold a pomegranate. Gemara's example, right? Then what? That's not a kli. That's no longer a kli. If it's not a kli, then by definition, it loses its tumah. Then, by the way, interestingly enough, if you repair the kli afterwards, the tumah doesn't come back, right? It's almost like it should be like a new kli. It's interesting enough, what the Mishnah is suggesting is like this: tear the garment. Now, again, we'll discuss what, how, what, right? Tear the garment. Once you tear the garment, what occurs? The tumah goes away. Tumah goes away. Once the tumah goes away, then bring it back into the mikdash, and then you could go ahead and do the kibbutz. Very interesting. Now, the Mishnah just illustrates this same idea in a number of different ways. Next, same idea. If, let's say, again, you have a kli cheres, right? So let's say the earthenware utensil, same idea. The earthenware utensil had, now I'll say this is not necessarily dam chatos. What is this? This is talking about over here, any absorptions, right? You cooked carbonic meat inside of a kli cheres. What do you do with it? And what do you have to do with the kli cheres? What do you have to do with it? You have to smash it. Where do you have to smash it? Inside the Beis Hamikdash. So now what happened over here is, but you took the kli cheres out. No problem. What should you do? So the Gemara says, nichnas v'shover makom kodesh. Take it back in, and smash it inside of the Beis Hamikdash. I nitma chutz l'kilayim. Okay, now here's my problem. Now what happens? That kli that had carbonic absorptions now is outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Outside of the Beis Hamikdash, it became tamei. So what do? I can't bring a tamei kli back into the Beis Hamikdash. So what should I do? Nokvo, bore a hole in it. This is what we were just mentioning before. Bore a hole in it. That boring of a hole makes the kli lose its identity. Once it loses its identity, then it becomes tahar. V'nichnas v'shovro b'makom kadosh. And then it will say, once it has the hole, it loses its tumah. Once it loses its tumah, then bring it back into the mikdash and then break it there. Amazing. One more example of this, kli nechoshes. This is a metal utensil. Now, nechoshes literally means copper, but again, it's any metal, right? So kli nechoshes yatsa chutz l'kilayim. Same idea. I have a kli nechoshes that's tamei. So we'll say, what am I supposed to do with it? What's the process called? Process for a metallic utensil. Marika and Shtifa. Marika and Shtifa has to be done inside the Beis Hamikdash. I took the kli outside of the Beis Hamikdash. No problem. So what's the halacha? Nichnas Marko b'shalfa makom kodesh. No problem. So rinse it and kasher it inside of the Beis Hamikdash. What happens after I took it out? It became tamei. Nitma chutz lekilayim. Now it became tamei outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say, so what do I do? Pochso v'nichnas. Pochso. So we'll say, so pochso means once again, make a hole in it. Now, interestingly enough, Rashi already points out, if you look at the Lashonos over here, the Lashonos are a little bit different by Kli Cheres versus Kli Nechoshes, right? By Kli Cheres, ultimately the Lashon is Nokvo. Nokvo sounds like a small hole. By metal utensils, it says pochso, which is a large hole. We'll discuss that, right? Make a large hole in it, loses its identity as a kli. When it loses its identity as a kli, it also loses its tumah. And then what? V'nichnas umarko v'shotzva makom kadosh. Then once it loses its identity, ultimately, again, it loses its tumah. Take it back into the Beis Hamikdash and go ahead and kasher it. Incredible. So we'll say that's our Mishnah. Maskif Ravina. So we'll say, so now we're going to focus on this. Let's start first with the beged, right? So remember again, Kohen gets chatas blood on his Kohanic garment. What's the halacha? Kibus. Then what occurred? The garment was taken outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, no problem. What do you do with it? Bring it back in. However, if it became tummy outside of the Beis Hamikdash, I can't just bring it back in because it's tummy. So what does the Mishnah say? Rip it, tear it, and then again somehow tear it, loses its tumah, bring it back in like that, and then launder it. So it says the Gemara Maskef Ravina Karo. I don't understand. If you tear it, beged amrachman of Allah beged to. Now remember, Rabbi said this is actually very interesting. The din of kibus only applies to what? To a beged, and once you tear it, it's no longer a beged. So in other words, what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, the mishayer bay kedei ma'afores. It means you tore it, but you left enough on the garment. Ultimately, maforos is literally a kerchief. So the idea over here is you went ahead and you tore it, but you still left enough of the functionality of the garment that it could do something. So because it could be something, interestingly enough, apparently, because you fundamentally changed it, therefore the tumah goes away. But because it is still functional, the identity of beged remained, and therefore the din of kibus still applies. Quite fascinating. So the Gemara says, "Ini, is that enough?" But the Gemara says, one second. The Gemara teaches elsewhere that halacha l'maisa. If you look at Rashi says over Hamar the paraka or v'harotav. So it's talking about over here if you have a tamei garment and the garment itself begins to tear. So here I will say the Mishnah says, the Gemara says that if the garment is large enough to be a kerchief, it still retains its identity. So you see from here that tearing it and still retaining kerchief size doesn't change the identity. If it doesn't change the identity, then the tumah remains. If the tumah remains, you still can't bring it inside. So what's going on over here? Top of Tzadik Hey. 95a midrabanan. We'll say in reality, that is only a din derabanan. Midda oraisa. If you go ahead and this is a nice looking amud for a Hanukkah morning, right? So midrabanan. So we'll say. So remember, interestingly enough, midda oraisa on a biblical level, when you tear the garment and its original identity is lost, you're good. When I say you're good is because the original identity is lost, therefore the tumah goes away. The Rabbanan were concerned, right? They were gozer that if the garment is still big enough to be a kerchief, that you're not going to tear it enough in order to allow it to use its identity. But the Rabbanan are the ones who said that if it's still kerchief size, it still retains its original identity. But midoraisa, which is what we're focusing on over here, midoraisa, you tear it enough that it's no longer functional in its original way, but it's still large enough for kerchief size that works to lose its original identity, which then loses its tumah, which for our purposes then allows it to be brought back into the Beis Hamikdash for kibbutz purposes. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, midrabanan, Gzera dilma lama asya lemikra ruba aval midoraisa tahora umutar lahachnisa mishum misas kibbutz. So I just want to point out that there's two different halachas happening over here. The general halacha, right, by tumah by garments says that you need to, if you want the garment to lose its tumah status, it needs to lose its identity. How does it lose its identity? by tearing it so that it's smaller even than a kerchief. Because we're concerned that if you tear it to kerchief size, a person is still going to leave too much of the original garment intact, and the tumah status is going to remain. But by kibos, we're going by the din da'oraisa. And the din da'oraisa says kerchief size is good enough to allow it to lose its original identity. Once it loses that original identity, then halacha l'maisa loses its tumah. Once it loses its tumah, you could bring it back in for kibus purposes. Incredible. Okay, both say top line, tzadikim and aleph. Kli cheres sheyatza. So same idea was with the kli cheres. There's one utensil. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Now, what did the Mishnah say? If the kli cheres ultimately again is right, had blood in it, or had sacrificial matter in it. So you have to, what do you do with the kli cheres? You have to break it. Where do you break it? Inside of the mikdash. In our case in the Mishnah, what happened? You took it out and it became tamei. So once you took it out and it became tamei, you can't bring it back in. So what did the Mishnah say to do? Nokvo. Make a hole in it. Make a hole in it, loses its identity, loses its tumah. You can now bring it back in and do marika and shtifa in the mikdash itself. Incredible. But one second, the Gemara says, but if you make a hole in it, kli amarach, one of a low kliu. But 1 second, once again, if you make a hole in it, it's not a kli. And I will say the Torah says that marika and shtifa only applies to a kli. So what's going on over here? Shenikav b'shorish katan. So this is actually a very interesting answer. We're talking about over here that you made a very small hole in it, the size of a small root, which is a very small hole. So the Gemara essentially says like this. Apparently, that hole is small enough that it causes the kli cheres to go ahead and lose enough of its identity that the tumah goes away, but not so much of its identity that it's not called a kli. Interesting. Okay, so a small enough hole to allow it to lose enough identity so that the tumah goes away and therefore can be brought back in, but not so big that halacha l'maisa, it's not called a kli and would not be subject to marika and shtifa. Fascinating. Okay, kli nechoshes pokso. Next case was a metal utensil. So what do you do with a metal utensil? So halacha l'maisa will say, so remember again, by kli cheres, the Torah uses this lashon of nokvo, all right? Nokvo. Now we've established nokvo means a very small hole. By kli nechoshes, by a metal utensil, the Mishnah uses the lashon ultimately again of pochso. Pochso is a much larger hole. So the Gemara says, I have a halav kliu, but 1 second. If you're making a large hole in a kli, right, in a metal utensil, I got it. I understand what you're trying to do. Cause the kli to lose its identity. If it loses its identity, it loses its tumah. I understand that. But also, if it loses its identity, it's no longer a kli. And if it's no longer a kli, then ultimately, again, there's no obligation of marika and shtifa. Turishin of a halav kliu. Diratziv miratziv. What's the case over here? We'll say, interesting enough, the case over here is, yes, you make a big hole in the utensil, but then after you make the hole, what do? You hammer it out and essentially make it whole again. So what I'm doing is I'm making a hole in the utensil. What that does is it allows the utensil to lose its tumah, but then I go ahead and in metal you could do this. You could hammer it back out so that it becomes whole. Once it becomes whole, now it's a kli. Once it's a kli, it's subject to marika and shtifa, which I will say, by the way, you see something very interesting. When the kli loses its identity, it loses its tumah, but it doesn't lose its blios. Right? It doesn't lose its absorptions. See, even though, again, the metal utensil, when you make a hole in it, it'll lose. Again, it's no longer tamei, but halacha might say any carbonic absorptions are still there. So that's what you'll do. Make a hole in it, a large hole in it. This way it loses its tumah status. Then repair it, and then bring it back into the Beis HaMikdash as a kli, and do your marika and shtifa. Incredible. Amrei Shlakish, mi'il shenitma machniso bepachos mishalosh al shalosh umechabs. Okay, so we'll say, this is a fascinating case. Let's say the me'il, right? The me'il, which is one of the begadim of the Kohen, like the tunic of the Kohen becomes tamei. Now look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi is right across. Me'il shel bigdei kahuna shenitas alav dam chatos v'yatza chutz lekilayim v'nitma machnis makom v'nafim. Okay, so I'll say, so now watch this. Here's what's occurred over here. In this case, same case of our Mishnah. The me'il of the Kohen became what got blood on it, blood dam chatos. No problem. Remember, as long as you're saying in the Beis HaMikdash, do your kibos. Then what happened? The me'il was taken outside of the Beis HaMikdash. When it was outside, it became tamei. So now, what do? What do I do? How do I rectify this situation? Now, both say, now, just to point out over here, you're not allowed, well, let's essentially go through it. So what do? You go ahead and you bring it into it's very interesting. You bring it into the Beis HaMikdash at less than 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths amounts. In other words, bring it into the Beis HaMikdash slowly. What is that? You take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, She'eno machnis shir beged tamei la'azara. Now remember again, you can't just bring in that me'il into the Beis HaMikdash. Why not? Because it's tamei, and you can't introduce tamei items into the Beis HaMikdash. So what can you do? Bring it into the Beis HaMikdash a little bit at a time. Remember again, a garment from less than 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths doesn't have the halachic designation of a garment. Therefore, again, there's no tuma issues. So bring it in a little bit at a time. Now the problem over here that we run into with a me'il, right? You say to yourself, one second, the Mishnah gave me the process for rectifying a tamei beged. The problem is you're not allowed to actively tear big day kahuna. There's a biblical prohibition to actively tear big day kahuna. As such, the remedy that the Mishnah puts down, which again is to tear the garment on the outside, allow it to go ahead and lose its tuma status, bring it back in, and then do kibus, won't work by big day kahuna. But what you can do is bring it in a little bit at a time, less than 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths, and launder it as it comes in. So essentially what you're doing over here is you are bringing in less than the shear of a beged. When you bring in less than the shear of a beged, any tumah that may be there is simply inconsequential. So bring it in a little bit at a time, launder it in that space of, or launder that piece of less than 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths at a time, and ultimately be metaher the clothing like that. Because the pasuk explicitly says you're not allowed to tear it. Not allowed to tear it. So that's the remedy by the me'il. Fascinating. So most of Rav Bar Ava raised the kasha. He said, one second, the avin varakim. So here's the problem. The Gemara says oven and rakim. Oven and rakim literally means very thick material or very thin material. Is not subject to the halachos of ultimately three finger breaths by 3 finger breaths. Right? Why? Take a look at Rashi. Because remember, very thick material and very thin material is not really usable for garment purposes. So as I say, interestingly enough, apparently very thick material, very thin material are not really usable for garments. What they're usable for is like you could sit on it. So because you could sit on it, the din of 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths doesn't apply to them. Rather, again, their shear is measured in hand breadths. So the Gemara says, so one second, so the me'il was thick material. So how can you give this eighth of 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths if that shear shouldn't apply? To which the Gemara says, no. Agav avihen chashivi. Since again, because the me'il itself is a garment, the smaller part of the me'il is reckoned as part of the larger garments. Again, when the Gemara says that a piece of material, thick material, thin material, that's mean when it says standalone material. But because this is already a garment, therefore the smaller pieces ultimately are looked at as part of the whole, and therefore you could use this eitzah of 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths. Therefore, we'll say, just to pause for just a second. Therefore, what we have over here is as follows. If it's a case of a garment that's not big day kahuna, that gets chatas blood on it, so it's subject to kibus. Kibus has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash. If you take the garment out of the Beis HaMikdash, what do? Bring it back in and do kibus. If it became tamei outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so what do? Tear it. When you tear it, ultimately it loses its identity as a garment. When it loses identity as a garment, it also loses its tumah. Then bring it back in, repair it, and then do kibus. What problem is if the garment is one of the big day kahuna? Then you're not allowed to tear it. So what do? What's the eitzah? Bring it back into the Beis HaMikdash in small amounts of less than 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths. That's less than the shear of a garment. Therefore, the tumah is inconsequential. And essentially, do kibus on each little bit as it enters in. Okay. The Gemara says we have a problem. Now, I will say the problem that the Gemara is going to bring up over here is a general issue with kibus. We just established before in the previous Mishnah that kibus has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash itself. Here's the problem. I will say, so we didn't get into this, but I think I was going to get into it. How do you launder clothing? Right? How do you launder? So the Gemara actually the Chazal have a very specific way in which laundering was done. You require 7 different ingredients. Some of them are literally herbs or spices, but it really means ingredients. Some of Nachman, dam chatos, umaros negoim. The way to remove dam chatos, and also the way to remove certain saras lesions, is you need these 7 different ingredients. So we'll say again, if you look at Rashi says over here, Vahaboi, Dam Chatos, Shivasa Manu Ashnim Mesechas Nida, Le'inyin Ksamim, Rok Tafel, Meraglayim, Neser, Boris, oil, Vikimunya, Va'ashlod. So these are all the ingredients, right? The one that we're being focused on over here is Meraglayim, urine. Urine apparently was one of the things that was necessary for laundering. Here's the problem, the Gemara says, V'tanya, ela she'in machnisim meraglayim lemikdash. We have a problem. What's our problem? Right? So again, kibbutz has to be done on the Beis HaMikdash. You're not allowed to bring urine into the Beis HaMikdash. So how do I do this exactly? So now we're jumping back, right? We're going back to, it's actually, this sugya really belongs a little bit more like in the previous Mishnah, because the previous Mishnah was the one that spoke about the idea that kibbutz has to be done in the Mikdash. Now the Gemara says, 1 second, how do you do kibbutz in the Mikdash? You need urine. So I will say, Tzadik 95b, v'chitema demivla lahu, bahadi shiva samamanim, this like this. No. It's not a big deal with the urine. Why? Because you take all of the ingredients and you mix them together. So because they're all mixed together, we don't view it as bringing urine. In other words, make the concoction outside of the Beis HaMikdash, bring it in. And by the time you bring it in, whatever it is, we just call it Tide. We'll just call it Tide now, right? So don't read the ingredients, right? So the Gemara says, Beis HaMikdash Tide, so just bring it in. The Gemara says, Vatnai, here's the problem. You can't do the Vatnan. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, the way that this laundering process works is you have these 7 ingredients, and they are used in a specific order. If you messed up the order, the kibbutz process does not work. Or if you mixed all of the ingredients together and then washed all of them together, it doesn't work. So apparently, again, it's order specific, and it is 1 by 1. So the Gemara says, okay, so once again, we're back to our urine problem. The chitema, the mivla luhu bahadi chad misamanim. So maybe you'll say this, I understand that I can't mix all of them together. But maybe you'll mix the urine with one other item. To which the Gemara says, but again, I will say, the Gemara Mesechus Nida brings down that there is a very specific laundering process. And again, what that requires is you take each of the items, and each of the items is rubbed on the beged 3 times by itself. So once again, sounds like the urine is being used by itself. But how can you bring urine into the Beis HaMikdash? The Gemara says, listen to this. What's the case? Interestingly enough, the case over here is where you actually dilute the urine with just saliva. So in other words, you put enough, because actually saliva is one of the ingredients. So apparently you dilute the urine with enough saliva that the urine identity is lost, and therefore you can bring it into the Beis HaMikdash. Because Reish Lakish himself said that saliva, Rok tapa literally means like tasteless saliva, as opposed to, let's say, saliva that you generate after you eat, right? So this is pre-eating or post-eating, saliva, right? So rok tafel, Reish Lakish says that saliva is mixed with each of the ingredients. So apparently, again, I don't know what the ratio is. Right? I'm sure the Gemara Mesechus Nida brings it down, but apparently enough saliva mixed with the urine makes it as if you're not bringing urine into the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore, again, Allah Chalamais, you can use this for your laundering process. Incredible. Mishnah. So now we're switching gears a little bit. So remember again the halacha. So remember, kibbutz is unique ultimately to dam chatos. Okay, but then these other halachas, for example, again, shvira, breaking of a kli cheres because of carbonic absorptions, or marika and shtifa, washing and kashering with, let's say, a metal utensil because of carbonic absorptions, that applies, right? Those halachas apply to any carbon. So therefore, again, whether you cooked karbanos in a kli, or you put hot carbonic matter. Now, I will say hot carbonic matter could be hot meat, right? Could be hot mincha, right? So you put hot carbonic matter into a kli. The Gemara says, echad kachei kadashim, echad kachim kalim. And again, whether the karbanos are kachei kadashim or they're kachim kalim, tu'unin mariko ushtifa. Ultimately, again, the utensil is going to require marika and shtifa. That's the halacha. Okay. The Gemara says, Shimon says, Kachim kalim ein tu'unin marika shtifa. So we'll say quite interesting. Rabbi Shimon says that kachim kalim do not require marika and shtifa. So therefore, I will say, so there's two things happening here in the Mishnah. So first of all, bless you. First of all, the Mishnah says, no, halacha number one is however the hot matter is coming into the kli, whether you're cooking in the kli or ultimately, again, you're pouring hot matter into the kli is going to require marika and shtifa. The machlokes and the Mishnah between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon is what does marika and shtifa apply to? Tanakama says, kachei kadashim, kachim kalim. Rabbi Shimon says, only kachei kadashim, not kachim kalim. Good. Let's analyze. Tanabanan. Asher tevu shalbo. Shabbos says, now remember, this concept of marika and shtifa is ukli chares asher tevu shalbo. If you have now this is earthenware utensil in which you cook carbonic matter, yishaber, it shall be broken. And if it's cooked, if you're cooking in a metal utensil, literally copper utensil, then ultimately again marika and shtifa. And I will say, if you notice, lashon on the pasuk is only by bishul. By bishul. Yet the Mishnah said that it applies by bishul as well as to pouring hot matter into it. So asher tevu shalbo emi ela shabi shalbo. How do I know that if I pour hot carbonic matter into the kli, that ultimately, again, the kli requires marika and shtifa? Talmud lomar asher tevu shalbo yishaver. Therefore, the pasuk says ultimately, again, that which you shall cook in it shall be smashed. Rashi says over here, midisamach yishaver eitzel bo v'lo kasav im kli cheres tevu shal yishaver. The medrash im nivla bal mikol makim yishaber. So this is with the Gemara dashing something very interesting, which is the yishaber is written next to the kli nechoshes. Because it's written next to the kli nechoshes, which ultimately again absorbs. Therefore, the Gemara understands over here that this halacha ultimately again is about absorption. Because it's about absorption, therefore we know absorption doesn't only occur through cooking, but absorption occurs even when a hot object is placed inside of a kli. Okay, incredible. So now we've established is whether you're cooking in the kli or ultimately, again, you're pouring hot carbonic matter into the kli, the din of marika and shtifa will apply. One more piece of review over here. But remember, marika and shtifa only applies to metal utensils because, again, by a kli charis, by an earthenware utensil, what's halacha? Yishaver, you have to smash it. Okay, so say, now the Gemara has to pass the question. So both said, listen to this. Let's say you have an earthenware, well, let's assume for a moment we're dealing with an earthenware oven, and you suspended sacrificial meat. You cooked sacrificial meat in the oven, suspended. Now, what's the chap with suspended? It's not touching any part of the kli. So what is the halacha? Mahu. What is the halacha ultimately, again, in this situation? Rashi says, "Tlo l'shiput shel chatas l'tzlosa ba'aver tanor tenispashel ba'aval lo nivla bo klum." So again, in this case over here, the Gemara says essentially, we are always assuming that how does absorption occur? How does absorption occur? Contact. So let's say again, I'm roasting my chatos inside of an earthenware oven. So the spit is in the oven, but the meat is not touching any part of the oven. What's the status now of that oven? So the Gemara says, Abishul ubiluhu dekapid rachmana. So again, I both say, do we say that the only time that carbonic absorptions pose a problem is both when there's cooking and absorption? Now, cooking, remember, again, requires heat, and absorption requires contact. So the Gemara says, "Oh, Dilma, abishul below bilua," or maybe not. Maybe I both say the halacha of either marika and shtifa or shvira by kli cheres is a din in bishul. If you cook sacrificial matter inside of a utensil, that triggers the need for a process. Whether there's absorption or not is irrelevant. So we'll say here the shaila is the din of by kli cheres shvira and by metal utensil marika and shtifa. Is it a din in bishul, in which, right, or is it a din in bishul and absorption? The nafkamina will be you cook an item in the utensil, but the utensil has no contact with the kli itself. That is bishul, but not necessarily absorption. Fasting. Amar Rav Shabbos says Tashma. Echad shebishabo ve'echad l'shir l'sochor oseach. So I said, well, look at this case. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said whether you cooked sacrificial matter in the kli or you poured hot sacrificial matter into it. Now, I will say, now that's a case of no cooking. Okay, the Mishnah says, no. So I'll say, no. No one's asking about a case of where there's absorption without cooking. Everyone agrees, absorption without cooking certainly a need for the process of marika and shtifa because there's an absorption. What's our question? Ki kami bailan bishul below bilua mai. Our question is where there's bishul but there's no absorption. Well, so isn't this fascinating? Now, again, so what's the case of bishul without absorption? I put a spit for a chatas inside of an oven. The chatas is roasting, so the bishul is happening inside of the oven. But the chatos is not touching any part of the oven. That's called bishul below bilua. Ultimately, again, cooking without absorption. Now, again, the Gemara is making the assumption that where there is no contact, there is no absorption. Okay, that's an assumption. But the shaila just is for our purposes, what happens in this case? So, Tashma, Tanur Shal Mikdash. Everybody say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop over here for today. Yeah, we'll stop over here for today. Then we'll rush the rest. We'll say, Shkoyach. Tremendous. Okay, so I'll leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. We'll pick up with this in Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Afreilichin Chanukah, everyone. Davening in the main shul in Meretz Hashem. No. I mean...